Shalom Bethel family. It's Thursday once again, time to review our Torah discussion from this past Saturday in the sanctuary here at Bethel in Norfolk. Last week we read Parshat Bo, which is an interesting parsha. It's got a lot of amazing content, the last few plagues, the first mitzvah, as we were reported by the rabbis, which is to keep the calendar. But last week we did something a little different, and we focused in on the prophetic voice. The reason we did that is because there is a lot of talk in rabbinic circles and in the Jewish community now about rabbis speaking with their prophetic voice. And it's a question about what exactly that means. And I think it's something we need to be really careful with. So Moshe, the greatest of our prophets, as well as teachers and leaders, speaks with a prophetic voice. What exactly does that mean? And more importantly, the reason we wanted to address this was because of the tragedy that I think is taking place with the Haftarah. Right? The Haftarah is the small passages from the prophets that we chant after the Torah portion in synagogue every week. And, when you have the Haftarah time comes, they're often pretty long, longer than it takes to read them in English. And what I see happening in the shul is that the chanting's going on and people are kind of starting to stare off into space, or they're kind of, nodding off a little bit and not really quite with what we're doing. I get it. It's long. It's a lot of Hebrew. Once you read it, what else are you going to do? The great tragedy of that, though, is that is exactly antithetical to what I believe the reason is that the rabbis included a Haftarah in the first place. Right? We don't know exactly when or why they added it in or how it was done. We know it goes back to very ancient times. In fact, there's a report in the New Testament of Jesus showing up in a synagogue and being asked to chant from Isaiah. It sounds like he just chants from a random place, wherever they were up to in the reading, as opposed to today where we have specific Haftarah that is tied to a given Torah reading. Right? Those customs were established over time and eventually became canonized and that's just how we do it. So we read the same Haftarah year after year connected to the same Torah portion. But when the rabbis first had this idea of putting in a Haftarah, of including the prophets, I think what they had in mind was they were including there the voice of passion and the voice of justice and the voice of ethics for our people. They said, if we're going to read a passage from the Torah, we should also read a passage from the prophets. The Torah will get the story and we'll get the laws, but from the prophets we'll get the spirit and we'll get the ethics. And this is the part, right? The part that's supposed to get us deep down in our hearts and in our kishkas, and that's the part where we're all spacing out. Because, like so many things, once there's a tradition to them and it's the same thing, we lose the thread of the passion, I think, that the rabbis were trying to insert. I was inspired to be thinking about this prophetic voice and the passion of our prophets last week when we celebrated Martin Luther King Day. I think many things that Martin Luther King said can be considered to have been said with a prophetic voice. And furthermore, I had questions about it when I saw that several of my colleagues were arrested in the Capitol Rotunda protesting on behalf of dreamers. Right, Choose for Dreamers, which I thought was very clever. And I wanted to understand what makes a prophetic voice and what are the dangers of saying we speak with a prophetic voice. And so I found a wonderful article online by Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, the former chief rabbi of Great Britain and brilliant thinker of our time. And he unpacks a little bit about what the role of the Israelite prophet, the Jewish prophet, is. And I think that's helpful in helping us understand how we, and not just rabbis, but all of us, have a prophetic voice with which we can speak. So first of all is to undo the myth of how we think of a prophet. If I ask you what makes a prophet, you will likely say they can predict the future. But that is not the definition of a Jewish prophet. A Jewish prophet predicts a future, but often that future doesn't come to pass. In fact, if the prophet has done his job well, that future will definitely not come to pass, right? Because often the prophet is prophesying about doom and destruction that's going to come if the Jewish people don't change their ways. Obviously, if the prophet is being effective, then that end will not come to pass. As Jonathan Sacks puts it, if a prediction comes true, it has succeeded. If a prophecy comes true, it has failed. So what are these attributes of the prophetic voice? So one, the prophet sees time differently, and we as Jews should see time differently. And how do we see time? Not the moment by moment by which a life is lived, but rather a grand arena in which this great drama between God and humanity is playing out. Right? So it is not, the prophetic voice is not the voice of a moment. It is not necessarily even the voice of addressing a specific issue. The prophetic voice is the voice of ethics and holiness that rings out over the course of all of human history. That voice needs to be made relevant in a moment, but that is not the same as, say, a political voice addressing a specific political issue. And that brings maybe us to the second attribute, great attribute of the prophetic voice, right? The prophet saw that there was an unbreakable connection between monotheism and morality, as Jonathan Sacks puts it. Monotheism and reality. That means that because of that connection, when we betrayed God in some way, when we failed to live up to the prescriptions of our religion, we were also corrupting our souls. And vice versa, when we acted immorally, we could not possibly have a strong relationship with God. The two are tied intimately. And so the prophetic voice becomes the moral voice through the ages, ringing out for justice and ethics. And lastly, and I think maybe most importantly, the prophet spoke about the power of God only as a secondary notion. What they were really important, they found really important was the righteousness of God. Right? Because God loved and redeemed Israel, we owe God something. Because God has acted righteously towards us, we owe God to act righteously in the world. Because of that, ethics were always placed over politics, right? The prophets did not speak to the politics of a moment. They spoke to the politics of how humanity treats humanity and how holiness and divinity creeps into that equation. And that is still the prophetic voice I think we are called upon to speak with today. That is the prophetic voice that Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King spoke with and spoke so much to our hearts. It wasn't the voice of the politics of the moment, the politics of the civil rights movement. It was the voice of the equality of humanity, of the divine connection between morality and how we treat each other, and religion and faith, to the divine drama playing out between God and people and how people treat each other. That was Martin Luther King's great gift. As far as my colleagues protesting in the rotunda, more power to them. I think that that's a wonderful thing if that's how you want to express your passion. Is it speaking with a prophetic voice? I think it could be explained that way. But when I think of speaking with a prophetic voice, I am more apt to speak with the voice of generations that we sense in our Tanakh, and to make those relevant passages connect to what is happening today. Last week, you can probably find it online, my colleague, Rabbi Michael Knopf in Richmond, spoke at the invocation of our new governor, Ralph Northam. And he did this beautifully, I think really spoke with the prophetic voice, weaving the words of our prophets into the priorities of today in a way that clearly superseded politics and called on all of us to step up in a way that was right and that was just. And I refer to that and hope you can find his speech online, because it was, I think, very craftily and artfully done. And remember that we all have the opportunity to speak with a prophetic voice. When we come to the time of the Haftarah, maybe it's time not to space out, not to take a break from our spiritual selves, but in fact to read the words on the page with a new pair of eyes that look, or maybe ears is a better word, ears that are tuned to hear that prophetic voice and to relate it to our time today, right? Not just to read through, but to read through for meaning, and to really understand the gift the rabbis gave us by placing the voice of the prophets in our morning service. And hopefully we'll all be able to adopt that kind of prophetic voice and bring it into the world, helping to bring that morality, helping to supersede the politics, and helping ultimately to play our part in this drama between God and humanity, helping to raise up humanity and to bring the sense of that divinity into the world. I hope we can all accomplish that, and certainly be inspired as we go forward by the tremendous, the amazing voice of our prophets. I wish you a Shabbat Shalom.